I was inspired by my students. I've been teaching a lot of intermediate to advanced students, ranging from high school age to professional freelancers who maybe have a classical background and want to learn to improvise. Or I've had people come to me and say, I've been playing classical music all my life. All of a sudden I've been asked to join a rock band. I have no idea where the violin fits in. How do I amplify this instrument? How do I use these pedals that you're using? Where do I come in? Where do I fit? So it came from a lot of the same questions being asked. And I looked around and saw that there's plenty of great books written about jazz improvisation, bebop, and whatnot, and also a lot of great books about bluegrass and fiddle music and maybe Irish music as well. Not a lot of books written about electric strings and specific techniques specific to electric string playing. And I thought it would be fun to have a book that talks a little bit about improvisation but also addresses issues of gear. Half of the book deals with improvisation. There's basic improvisation. We talk about blues, funk, rhythmic techniques like chopping, things like that. How to arrange for a rock band if you're arranging a string section. How to work with DJs, things that I haven't seen addressed. And the other half talks about how to choose an electric violin, how to actually work with effects pedals, what techniques, how to make them sound musical, how to choose an amplifier, things like that. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to cover all of that material in one book. Well, I found one of the hardest things was to find a methodology for things that I've sort of been doing automatically through a lot of trial and error over the years. Just, you know, how to teach chopping, a step-by-step process, how to really, you know, no one's ever written an etude for the whammy pedal, at least not that I know of. So I thought it would be fun to try to do that. There's plenty of etudes on traditional violin techniques like ricochets and double stops and triple stops and things like that. But wouldn't it be cool to have actual exercises that help you develop coordination between your feet and your hands, for example? So that's one thing. And also trying to really crystallize things that I have done through just messing around that I sort of take for granted and try to come up with a step-by-step process for teaching them. That's been the biggest challenge, and it was a huge education for me to figure out how to do that. There's a lot of advanced stuff in the book, but there's also something for people who have never improvised before. I always start all my students off on the blues because I believe the blues is the cradle of Western musical civilization. If you can't play the blues, you can't play rock and roll, you can't play funk or jazz or even hip-hop. So if you just open my book and read chapter 3 and 4, which is blues and modal music, you can already hold your own in a rock band or a blues band. So it's an easy first step to just learn the pentatonic and blues scale and be able to jam on that, and I talk about some of the concepts, and also it's a point of departure because I recommend some other books and recordings that'll take you to the next level with those styles. I would say diversify, diversify, diversify. The traditional way that string players make a living, first of all, if they're fortunate enough to land an orchestra job, God bless them, that's great. But the rest of us are out there plugging away, freelancing, playing in different orchestras, and teaching, which is great. But there's other opportunities as well. If you get into the world of electronics and improvisation, no matter where you live, you can find a band that can use your services. You can record and do string parts for people. There's a lot of different opportunities to make a living, and the more skills you have and the more styles of music you're able to adapt to. I sort of look at it like an actor learning different dialects. The more different musical dialects you learn, the more hireable you'll be. So I would say don't rule anything out. I think the first easy step is to get a pickup. If you're just playing on an acoustic violin, you can have your bridge replaced by a transducer like this for about $150 $200, you can get a transducer and already be able to plug in to an amplifier or a PA system. If you don't want to replace your bridge, there are transducers and pickups that can clip on to your bridge without damaging anything. So for a relatively low price, you can already take the first step and be able to play with a loud band. Of course, if you just use a microphone, it's not quite the same. You got to be able to plug in. The next step is buying a solid body electric instrument like this. Of course, a solid body instrument, it'll only sound if you plug it into an amplifier. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Of course, it's easiest to just start with a 4-string electric violin, but they make 5 strings, 6 strings, 7-string violins with and without frets, all kinds of designs, so you have to really explore and look around and find what's right for you. But then, of course, after that, the next step is buying an amplifier, and then if you want to get really crazy, get into using effects pedals, and you're opening up a whole new world for yourself. But it's a gradual process, so take your time. I grew up on all the traditional method books that violinists use. You know, the Kreutzer, Don't, Sevcik, Etudes were extremely helpful for my technique. But I also studied improvisation starting in high school. And in college I studied with David Baker, who's a great jazz educator. His How to Play Bebop, Volume 1, 2, and 3, and his books on improvisation and arranging really helped me out. I'm also a big fan of Dave Liebman's Chromatic Improvisation book. And there's a cool book for guitarists called The Advancing Guitarist by Mick Goodrick. Even though it's not written for violin players, there's a lot of general concepts that really inspired me. And I always encourage my students to look outside of their instrument for inspiration. It forces you to think outside the box and get away from things that are idiomatic to your instrument. Get away from the cliches of your instrument. Well, these days with technology, you can make a living as a musician no matter where you live. You could be living in a hut in the middle of the frozen tundra. If you have a home studio set up and you advertise yourself, you can record music for anyone in the world. I mean, I've recorded string parts for singers in Israel, for soldiers in Afghanistan that were writing music in their spare time, for musicians all over the country. And you know, now you can just email tracks back and forth. So that's one way. You don't have to live in New York, LA, or Nashville. Also, no matter where you live, I guarantee you there are bands within, you know, a 3-hour driving radius of your hometown, or in your hometown. There's probably tons of bands. You got to get out there, pound the pavement every night, go to every jam session, get yourself seen and heard as much as possible. And having strings in a rock band is the big thing right now. There's a lot of bands I see with cello and violin, more and more over recent years. So just make yourself known. And this is all in addition to the traditional avenues of playing in orchestras, playing chamber music, and teaching. Of course, if you want to move to a big city like New York or LA, the competition is fierce. There's a lot of talent, but if you believe in yourself, and if you're really talented, and if you don't give up, and if you pound the pavement every night, you will eventually succeed and start working. It might take some time, but it will happen. It's a matter of being persistent. Don't be afraid to go out there and make a total fool of yourself over and over and over again. The way I learned to improvise and play jazz, my summers during college, I grew up in Cleveland. So what I would do, instead of getting a real job, I would call all the bookstores and little cafes around town and book jazz duo and trio gigs. And I would shamelessly hire the best jazz musicians in town. And a lot of the time, those guys would make me sound bad. But this was an excuse not only to make some money, but to play next to great musicians. And eventually I had to rise to the occasion. This made me a better player. Also, as far as using pedals are concerned, I would drag pedals to the gigs and force myself to incorporate them. And through a lot of trial and error, I would figure out what works and what doesn't work, and that's how you develop techniques with timing. I think using pedals and improvising, there's a lot of commonalities. Learning to do things tastefully, learning about musical development and timing, that only comes through experience. So basically, I think a lot of things beginning improvisers have problems with is overcoming fear and shyness. Don't be afraid to sound ugly or make a mistake. Go out there and just put yourself out there in as many playing situations as possible. And eventually, you will definitely grow as a musician.